It's been almost 25 years since Congress passed the Federal Water Pollution Control Act amendments of 1972, the Clean Water Act for short. The Clean Water Act established a national agenda with a clear goal: to make our lakes, rivers, and coastal waters fishable and swimmable once again. After 25 years and billions of dollars in clean water programs, what has the real value of that effort been to the environment and the economy? To see how far we've come, we need to turn the clock back to the late 60s and early 70s, when virtually every state had a river or a lake or a coastline in a crisis condition. In almost every case, two problems were quickly identified: massive amounts of sewage and wastewater from the population boom that followed World War II, and industrial waste of every description.
25 years ago, it was a very dramatic example of how polluted a stream can get. There are many references refer to the stream as an open sewer, and certainly it was that.
This was a very offensive place. We wouldn't stand here today with the wind blowing out of the southwest. We would be in a building because it would be nauseating. You would see dead animals floating, you'd see debris, you'd see various types of sewage, and it was commonplace.
The smells were bad. People were afraid to put their boats in the river for fear that the boats would dissolve. And you couldn't find a fish alive for at least the lower 45 miles of the river.
Many accounts refer to the rusty old Cuyahoga River, and that was due to a lot of the pickling liquors, pickling waste, which were acids that were used to clean the steel. So you had this rusty colors. A lot of the dischargers had bright orange, and they made the river the same color. We also had a lot of oil floating around the river, not just sheens. We had glops of oil. By today's standards, they would be considered spills, and it would be a major environmental problem, and nobody did anything about it.
And the property values here were, you could buy a building down here for the price of a good high-priced car.
I always use the example of a facility that was built down on the lakefront, a new hotel, and it was built with no windows on the lakefront side in a parking garage. And it really was symbolic of the neglect that we had wreaked upon our waterfront, our lakefront, and our river. And
just starting with the agency, I was just appalled. The river had a very strong odor to it, but the riffle area was covered with something we call sewage fungus. This is a gelatinous mass of bacteria that grows on the bottom of the stream, and it kind of waves in the currents of the water, and the area was just covered with that sewage fungus. And there was a lot of blood waste in there. There was a rendering plant nearby, and it was, this was, I remember a couple weeks after I started with the agency, and I really wondered, what have I gotten myself into?
"25 years ago, every community on Tampa Bay was discharging their wastewater into the bay. And you had various gradients of treatment. You had primary, you had secondary, and in some cases maybe raw sewage. So Tampa Bay was a receptacle for sewage.
It was suffering many adverse effects from that excess sewage. There were obvious signs of fish kill due to low dissolved oxygen in the water. The seagrass beds, which had been prominent over much of Tampa Bay, were being destroyed by the clouding of the water created by these excess nutrients and the algae growth that accompanied them. The lack of light was destroying much of the natural seagrass vegetation in the bay.
We used to have tremendous, back 25 years ago, we'd have tremendous buildup of algae masses in the bay that would bloom from all of the nutrient from the sewage discharges. And it would build up along Bayshore Boulevard in Tampa, which is a very nice part of the city, and very picturesque. But the decaying algae would drive people away because the odors from the decaying algae were so terrible.
This hydrogen sulfide smelled like rotten eggs when that decomposed along the shoreline there. There were actually two major polluters of the bay where a lot of these nutrients came from. One was the City of Tampa's wastewater treatment plant, and the other source was the the fertilizer industry. About 50% of all the phosphorus fertilizer which is produced in the world is produced here in Tampa Bay area. And the fertilizer is shipped out of the port of Tampa. And with the shipping of the fertilizer, there is losses occurring during the process of transportation and loadings of the ships.
The water quality was so poor in Tampa Bay that we lost a very important resource, namely scallops. Scallops are like the miner's canary. They're very sensitive to water quality, and they were one of the first resources that responded to poor water quality and disappeared completely from our bay system.
I guess the nadir of the river would be the 1960s, when in October of 1965, President Lyndon Johnson declared that the Potomac was a national disgrace. It reeked regularly, especially in the summertime, large mats of algae. Nobody wanted to be near the river. Huge fish kills, hundreds of thousands of fish would die. Migratory fish coming up, hitting the river up in this area especially, would run out of oxygen and die, and that was probably the worst conditions that we know of.
All those people coming into the basin and all the changes in land use that's have gone on, all the shopping centers, the construction of the Beltway and its many accessory highways, all of that's occurred in that time period. And with those people came their inevitable use of the common toilet. And that increase in wastewater flow was damning to the Chesapeake.
Because we were dealing not only with traditional sewage, we were dealing with toxic problems, and most importantly, we were dealing with an oversupply of nutrients that had gotten into the system and had created a surplus of algae, thereby covering the bottom and removing the oxygen from the waters.
One of the major differences between the eastern states and the western states is there's a large groundwater supply that's tapped for drinking water in the western states that needs to be protected. And also, many of the rivers are highly regulated with dams and reservoirs. And another unique feature of the western coast is its narrow continental shelf and deep ocean waters, which can be used for wastewater disposal. These outfalls have been effectively used to discharge some of the waste from the larger cities such as Los Angeles, San Diego, Seattle, and Honolulu. Through the 60s, these new entities that formed to take care of the sewerage were building large trunk sewers, having to build plants to keep up with this growth. In California, there were some serious water pollution problems. The fish had what we call a disease called fin erosion because they were exposed to contaminated sediments. The beaches had been closed because of bacterial contamination. The fish had high levels of contaminants and were not safe to eat. In San Francisco proper, there were problems associated with combined sewer overflows, much as we're seeing in Cleveland, Boston, and other areas. During storms, these overflows would cause nearshore contamination problems that had to be resolved. Seattle had some highly industrialized areas in the south parts of the Puget Sound, the Duwamish Estuary in particular, that had some very severe pollution problems. They had tumored fish. The fish were not safe to eat. The levels of contaminants and sediments were extremely high.
To put it into a historical context, all of those cities at about the same time, roughly within a decade or so, came to the conclusion that you had to do something with their sewage. In the 1960s, the state governments had the primary authority for regulation of wastewater discharges, and the federal government had a very limited role. States did not do a very good job of managing wastewater disposal during the era of the 1950s and 1960s. The federal government held innumerable conferences and various attempts at trying to address the problems, trying to solve the things, but they had no regulatory authority.
In 1969, a single event captured the attention of the nation. The fire on Cleveland's Cuyahoga River played a large role in the development of the Clean Water Act, and to some degree, the entire environmental movement.
The fire on the Cuyahoga River, that was an embarrassment to the people of Cleveland. It served as the springboard, really locally, for some actions as well as federal.
Well, first of all, the reporting was just about completely inaccurate. The fire was caused by debris caught under a railroad bridge that was dry, and these what they called submarine cars or hot metal cars going over, and a piece of slag falling down onto the debris, catching the debris on fire, which started the bridge on fire. So in order to save the bridge, they broke the debris loose.
And the oil, combined with the oil floating on the river, of which there's a tremendous amount, just coated the logs. They acted like wicks.
And the debris, naturally being wood, was burning and floating simultaneously, so the river was on fire.
It was enough to damage a bridge, and for the most part, nothing more. In fact, the boat behind us, the Anthony Celebrezzi, was the boat that responded to the fire. It's still on the river today, although it doesn't have quite the same purpose that it did 25 years ago. So the fire was out even before press could get down to the scene. All the pictures that exist of that fire are after the fact, which is interesting, because nationally this fire is perhaps the most famous.
Although the attention was bad attention, it made everybody aware. It sort of solidified everybody into being in complete accord with the fact that, hey, we've got a problem here, and why don't we really look at it?
In a fundamental way, it led to cleaning up of the river and the lake. I mean, we were very unproud of the burning river and the dead lake. And in fact, some of the environmental legislation started by Cleveland congressmen and Cleveland school kids testifying before Congress about the river and the lake and the conditions and the need to bring these bodies of water back.
It launched not only local action from wastewater treatment authorities, but also served to really focus the debate at the federal level.
That debate helped actually fuel the Clean Water Act enactment in 1972, which was a very strong turning point for water pollution control in the United States.
The focus became not on attempting to define the water quality-based standards for a particular waterway like the Potomac or the Hudson River. Rather, it became a technology-based approach where municipalities were required to implement what was considered a secondary level of wastewater treatment. This level would remove, instead of about 1/3 for a primary level, this would remove about 85 to 90% of the municipal wastewater load that was discharged into the rivers.
The first thing that started to happen was an investment in infrastructure, sewage treatment plants, the development of guidelines for what industrial pollution reduction ought to be achievable.
The federal government at the same time put up a fair chunk of money through the construction grants program to fund this. The federal government said the city shall implement secondary wastewater treatment, and the federal government put up money to support that policy.
It provided the basically the financing and the legal structure to allow for a massive remediation and cleanup to take place. And we've invested about $1.2 billion over 20 years in the cleanup, and the very important and critical part and stimulus of that was about $550 million that came to the sewer district through Clean Water Act construction grants. And,
if you had to point to one thing that is responsible for the cleanup that we've seen over the last 25 years, it would be the Clean Water Act. And more specifically in the water programs would be the NPDES permitting program, which basically requires anyone discharging wastewater, be it an industry or sewage treatment plant, to treat that wastewater before it's discharged to the rivers. And through a process of about 20 years, the regulations have set expected levels of cleanup, and the river has responded. We've seen dramatic improvements in the water quality as a result of that program.
Cleaning up the nation's waters took a lot more than laws and dollars. It demanded partnerships and alliances that were, in some cases, unprecedented. Partnerships between the federal government and neighborhood organizations, large and small businesses, and individuals, from research scientists and public officials to community volunteers.
What happened was that the community pull together the local governments coupled with the citizen groups that were forming at that time in the area in response to the environmental movement. And with support from the state and from EPA to a large degree through the Clean Water Act, made a commitment to clean up those sewage treatment plant discharges.
And so when we had the Clean Harbors Conservation Committee, part of the group was the Corps of Engineers, part of the group was the Coast Guard, part of the group was Ohio EPA and federal EPA, and we all sat down as a group.
And this brought together scientists, this brought together government officials, and in the case of the Potomac River and the Chesapeake Bay, an interstate group grew to do improvements together in a targeted effort to clean up the Chesapeake Bay.
And people, instead of just bickering and saying it's their fault or it's not our fault, we're not the only ones, they got together and started working on the problem.
The Tampa Bay National Estuary Program was established as a partnership between the local communities and EPA and the Florida Department of Environmental Protection at the state level to develop a strategic plan for bay restoration and protection, to bring diverse interests to the table, to both help in the development of some of the strategic plans, but also to vest them in the outcome. Typically, and in some cases, you have a lot of disenfranchised interests that feel that they are on the receiving end of plans and things that are forced upon them. And we've made a great effort in Tampa Bay, not only to bring local communities, but utilities, businesses, agricultural interests, recreational and commercial fishermen to the table, to make them a part, to give them a voice in the development of this plan, and to establish common ground. And there is a great deal of common ground in environmental protection of the bay.
What we really needed was better water quality to provide for the grasses, because the grass, like your lawn grass, requires light, and without light penetrating the water, the grasses can't grow.
And it's on the bottoms that the crabs and the critters and the grasses grow, then that's what makes the bay so productive.
The vegetation declined markedly and went down to about 34,000 acres in terms of its coverage. Now, the good news is that during the 10 years or so that we've been working to restore the bay, that vegetation has come back, and it's in the upper 60,000 acres now.
The beds are starting to get denser. This one that we are sitting above right now is quite a bit denser than a lot of the ones that we've seen in the area. So we're both getting denser and we're getting more acreage. It's a good success.
In the 1980s, the road to the goal of making our waters fishable and swimmable led to an interesting discovery. The environmental renewal of the nation's waters also triggered an economic renewal of cities across the country. Now, the value of clean water programs took on new meaning and new measurements. Improvements in dissolved oxygen levels, reductions in toxics and algae blooms, and the return of seagrasses went hand in hand with redevelopment and renewal in cities, along with investment in new and restored businesses and the jobs that went with them. New sources of revenue were created from convention, tourism, and recreational activities in areas which, just a few years earlier, had been given up for lost.
Where cities have been on the waterfronts, they've tended to turn their backs as a result of decades of pollution. Now that the waters are getting cleaner, they're seeing not only a prettier waterfront in a traditional sense, they're also seeing much economic activity that was not there before. So if you were to go to a place such as downtown Baltimore in the early 70s, what you would be stumbling around in along the waterfront would be rail yards and abandoned factories. Today, if you were to go there, you'd see an incredible amount of activity surrounding a series of museums, shops, recovery of restaurants, all surrounding the waterfront. And that's really a direct result of the cleaner water.
What people don't understand coming down here, either as business people or as people visiting it, how vital the waterfront is to the success of operations here. Because people come down during the summer to see the recreational boats, to see the huge freighters, see wildlife now on the river, which we had never seen up until probably 5 years ago. They enjoy themselves, seeing all these things on the river. The river and the riverfront view is an extremely important part of what we have to offer the public.
At one point in time, there was really no reason to want to be on the water. It was a very unattractive place. That's all changed, and people are celebrating the fact that it's a clean river. It's an attractive place to be. There's a lot of pleasure boating. There's a very real connection between the quality of water, which is something of a technical issue to a lot of folks, and what happens when you've got an attractive place, a place that people can come to and feel like they can have a dinner, they can go to a park. People want to be by the water. They enjoy it, and it's because the lake is a pleasant place to be. So there's a very strong development component to all of this work.
Last year, for the first time, several businesses made out renting jet skis, and people would come down and hop on a jet ski and float around on the Cuyahoga River and go out into Lake Erie. It serves as a great staging ground for people that go out there.
The significance of this, I think, is that the direct relationship between clean water and the investment the public makes and economic activity like this waterfront development, like people making their living on the river, these things could not have happened, would not have happened if the investment and the investment that the country has made in clean water did not occur. And the Potomac River is a totally perfect example of a 20-year government program that has actually been successful, and you can point to tangible evidence of that.
Measuring the economic benefits of water quality is not easy. In fact, part of it is controversial. Water quality is not something that you trade on the market. We don't buy and sell water quality. So we have to look at other means and other ways to measure the value of water quality. One of the ways we do that is by how people use water quality. They use it in recreation, boating, fishing, swimming. They use it in industry. It's an important input to a lot of industries, from computer chips to soft drinks, commercial fishermen, irrigation for agriculture. How do you measure the value from cleaner water? Well, you look at the expenditures. The Sport Fishing Institute did a study. They estimated that the sport fishing industry added to the economy $24 billion a year. They estimated that there are over 50 million anglers in the United States of all ages. These anglers spend money on rods and reels, on boats and motors. They spend money on trips, on lodging, on food, on drink, on travel expenditures, on trailers for their boats. All this was added together, and they came up with $24 billion impact, because someone has to produce that. And you talk about the manufacturers and the wholesalers and the retailers. They talked about people in the hotel industry. What that adds up to is that 1.3 million jobs are created just for the sport fishing industry.
One industry that's dependent on clean water, you're talking about in excess of $20 billion a year of positive economic impact on the United States economy. And you can go on about tourism, waterfront development, industrial needs for clean water, and the cost of not having to clean it up so that we can drink it. You look at all of those things, and you can see this everywhere you go in the country.
The whole downtown in St. Petersburg, as an example, has started to come alive. The pier, there was an old pier there. It was demolished in 1968. This was built in about 1969 or 70. And this year we will set the all-time attendance records for the pier. There'll be about 2 million people that will go out to that pier.
We all benefit from the Bay, and there's clearly an economic benefit to this region from Tampa Bay. We're a tourist-based economy. We also have a major, one of the nation's 10 largest ports in our backyard. So there is a clear economic tie to the vitality of the bay and the wildlife that it supports.
I don't know what this bay would have looked like if we hadn't done something, but with all the direct discharges we had, it's tough to visualize the pollution that would be in that bay today. And this city would have not been livable.
In this region here, the waterfront in Alexandria and Georgetown, changed dramatically. People wouldn't even consider going out in a boat in the Potomac in the midsummer. Back in the 60s, there weren't any largemouth bass at all, no bass in the river that we knew of. And in 1976, somebody caught one. It was big news and made the Washington Post. Now there's a lot of boating, there's a lot of fishing and recreation. The businesses are building back up along the river, and the investments that we put into those facilities back in the 70s are coming back, returning to us in revenue and tax dollars from the very adjacent lands that were abandoned pretty much in the 60s.
And we're using the resources that we have to bring you to the table and try to get you to do things that are going to be cooperative and good in terms of natural systems, and to leave alone the parts of the system on which we and probably you all rely in terms of the economic benefits of the bay. You can't mess up a bay the way Baltimore Harbor was messed up in the past, or mess up a river the way the Potomac was messed up in the past, and expect to support the kinds of recreational, tourism, aesthetic, residential interests that you all want to see prosper.
When you look at the progress we've made just in general, not even considering the economics, in 1972, when the Clean Water Act was enacted, almost 60% of the waters of the United States did not meet their designated uses. Today, only 40% do not. We've been making significant progress. We have over 40,000 industries now in the United States controlling their discharges. We have over 15,000 sewage treatment plants above or at the secondary treatment level. In 1972, none of that existed. So you have measurable, achievable progress from a government program that's been in existence for a mere 20 years and has made significant progress. And all too often we hear about how government can't achieve. And here's an example where a law was passed, the federal government, the state's governments, the local governments, and industry working together have achieved in 20 years such significant progress that it's just amazing to me the benefits that have been accrued to the United States. Now, on the other hand, there's still that 40% we have to deal with. We can say that we've been successful, but there's still more to be done. We can't afford to go backwards in what we've achieved. The economics of the country, I think, are at stake in terms of use of water and our aquatic resources. So even though we've achieved a lot, there's more to be done, and we have to be able to maintain what we've done already. And the costs of the country, I think, are just too great to not do that.